My name is Nora Whitfield. I'm 69 years old. I spent 35 years as a senior trust officer at Lowcountry Trust and Savings, and in those 35 years, I managed over 200 family trusts without ever losing a dollar to fraud on my watch. Not one. So when I stood outside my son's sunroom on a Tuesday evening in April and heard him say, "Once she's gone, we split the 4.2, I didn't drop the casserole dish I was carrying. I didn't gasp. I set it down on the hallway table very quietly, the way you set down evidence you don't want to disturb, and I listened. I was supposed to be in the kitchen putting away leftovers. My grandson Mason was doing homework at the counter. My granddaughter Lily was watching cartoons in the den. I'd driven over after work, if you can call retirement work, to bring dinner because Preston had told me Vanessa had a showing that ran late. That's what my son does. He tells me small true things to cover larger untrue ones. I'd built a career on knowing the difference. Through the cracked sunroom door, I heard my son's voice, low, the voice he uses when he thinks no one but his wife is listening. Tabitha says 6 to 8 months once we file. Camellia Manor already has a bed. Once she's gone from the house, once the guardianship clears, we split the 4.2. 50-50. That's what we agreed. A pause. Then, no, Nessa, I'm not being cold. I'm being practical. Someone has to be. I am a woman who spent 3.5 decades reading trust documents for language exactly like that. Once she's gone. I've seen those 4 words end up in depositions before. I've seen them destroy families slower than a shooting and just as completely. And I stood in my son's hallway with a casserole dish cooling on the table and understood, with the particular clarity that comes from decades of reading fine print, that my son and his wife were not waiting for me to die. They were planning to make me disappear while I was still breathing, and split 4.2 million while I sat somewhere with a bed and a view and no vote in my own life. I didn't confront them that night. In 35 years managing other people's money, I learned the single most important rule of any financial investigation: you never accuse until the file is complete. So I picked the casserole back up, walked into the kitchen, kissed my grandchildren goodnight, and drove home in the dark with my hands steady on the wheel and my mind already opening a file I would come to call, simply, the Whitfield matter. Welcome back to Gia Mom Stories, where mothers share the moments that tested everything they built, and the quiet precision that carried them through. If tonight's story sounds like something in your own family, stay with me to the end, drop a comment, and subscribe. My name is Nora Whitfield. I was born Nora Castellano, in Beaufort, South Carolina, where the tide comes in twice a day whether anyone's watching or not. My father repaired shrimp boat engines on the waterfront. My mother kept the books for half the small businesses on Bay Street, in pencil, in a ledger she balanced to the penny every single night before bed. I used to sit at our kitchen table as a girl and watch her fingers move down columns of numbers. And I understood before I understood anything else in this world that numbers don't lie, but people lie about numbers constantly, and the only defense against that is patience. I went to the College of Charleston on a partial scholarship and worked nights at a diner to cover the rest. I graduated with a degree in finance and took a teller job at Lowcountry Trust and Savings the same month I graduated, 22 years old, sharp blazer, sharper pencil. I worked my way up through operations, then into the trust department, then into a private office with my name on the door, Nora Whitfield, Senior Trust Officer. I held that title for 28 years before I retired. Here's what a Senior Trust Officer does, in case you've never had reason to know. Families come to you with money they'd built over a lifetime, and they ask you to make sure it does what they intended after they're gone, or after they can no longer manage it themselves. You draft the language. You administer the accounts. You watch for the moment, and there is almost always a moment, when someone in the family decides the money should move faster than the document allows. I have seen sons petition to remove elderly mothers as trustees of their own funds. I have seen daughters forge signatures on distribution requests. I have seen a nephew convince a judge that his aunt, sharp as a tack, was incompetent, purely so he could access a spendthrift trust 2 years early. I testified in 11 contested guardianship and trust disputes over my career. I was never once successfully impeached on the stand, because I have never once presented a number I could not source. I managed money for shrimping families and shipping executives, for a woman who ran a chain of laundromats and left $1.8 million to a scholarship fund, for men who built fortunes out of nothing and wanted to make sure their children didn't unbuild them in a single bad decade. I know exactly what it looks like when a family starts circling money before it's rightfully theirs. I know the vocabulary. I know the paperwork. I know the 6-month timeline for an uncontested guardianship petition in the state of South Carolina, because I have watched other families walk that timeline more times than I can count. I still remember the Kittredge matter, my 9th year at the bank, a case that taught me more about family greed than any textbook ever could. An elderly widower, sound of mind, active in his own affairs, whose younger son convinced 2 doctors and a judge that his father's mild hearing loss was early dementia, purely to gain control of a boat-building fortune 11 months before the man's actual, natural death. I was the one who caught the inconsistency. A signature dated the same week the son's own petition claimed his father could no longer hold a pen steady. I spent 4 months rebuilding that timeline, hour by hour, bank slip by bank slip, before I ever said a word to anyone above me. The son lost the petition. I never forgot how close it came to succeeding, or how ordinary the son looked in a suit, sitting in the back of that courtroom, certain right up until the final page that he'd get away with it. I thought of him often, 11 months into the Whitfield matter, because Preston wore the same suit anti-certainty every single Sunday he sat across my table pretending nothing at all was wrong. I retired at 66, 3 years ago, the same year my husband Walter died. People assume I retired because of the grief. That's not quite true. I retired because Walter asked me to, in the last clear conversation we had, and because I wanted 6 months with him before the cancer took the rest of the clarity from his eyes. I got 4 months instead of 6. Pancreatic cancer does not negotiate on your terms. Walter Whitfield was a marine engineer. He designed hull reinforcement systems for shrimp trawlers and later for commercial shipping vessels out of the port of Savannah, 40 minutes from our house. He was not a flashy man. He drove a 15-year-old truck with a toolbox bolted to the bed. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts in rotation for a decade. But Walter built things that lasted, and he thought about money the way he thought about steel, nothing dramatic, just load-bearing, quiet, engineered to hold weight for a very long time. Over 40 years of marriage, Walter and I built what became the Walter Whitfield Family Trust. It wasn't inherited money. It was Walter's engineering consulting fees, invested patiently, year after year, plus my own trust officer's salary, which I never spent frivolously because I watched other families lose fortunes to frivolous spending for 3 decades and refused to be one of them. By the time Walter was diagnosed, the trust held $4.2 million. Not because we were extraordinary. Because we were consistent, for 40 years, in a way almost no one has the patience for anymore. Walter's will was simple in its intent and precise in its structure, because I drafted the framework myself and had it reviewed by an outside estate attorney so no one could later say I'd written myself a favor. I am the primary income beneficiary of the trust for my lifetime. Upon my death, the corpus divides, 60% to our 2 children, Preston and Diane, in equal shares, and 40% held in a separate education and legacy sub-trust for our 4 grandchildren, released in staged distributions as they reach 25, 30, and 35. I am also named as sole trustee, with a successor trustee provision naming a corporate trustee, not either of my children, should I become unable to serve. Walter and I built that provision very deliberately. We loved our children. But Walter had watched, secondhand through my career, exactly what happens when children become trustees over their own inheritance. He used to say, "Nora, you've told me 100 stories about families that ate themselves alive over money that hadn't even arrived yet. Let's not leave that door unlocked for ours." So we didn't. The trust names me, and only me, as trustee, until a corporate successor takes over. Preston and Vanessa have known this document exists in outline for years. What they did not know, what almost no one outside my attorney's office knew, was exactly how airtight that successor trustee clause was written, because I wrote it myself, in language I'd used to defeat 6 family petitions over my career. That is the frame Preston and Vanessa were standing inside when I heard them in that sunroom. A frame I built. With my own hands, over 40 years, the same hands that had spent 3.5 decades defending other families' money from exactly the kind of plan my son was describing on the phone. Let me tell you about my son, because he is not a villain in the way villains are written. He is a disappointment in the way disappointments actually happen, slowly, one compromise at a time. Preston Whitfield is 44. He was a bright, easy child, the kind of boy teachers liked without much effort on his part. He went to Clemson, got a business degree, and spent his 20s in corporate sales, moving up steadily, nothing spectacular but nothing alarming either. He married Vanessa Cole 11 years ago. Small wedding, a chapel on Hilton Head. Walter walked Vanessa's mother down for a photo because her own father wasn't in the picture, literally or otherwise. I liked Vanessa at first. She was sharp, ambitious, a real estate agent who worked harder than anyone I knew to build her own book of clients from nothing. 4 years ago, Preston did something out of character. He left a stable regional sales director position to invest in a restaurant venture with a college friend, a coastal seafood concept in a renovated warehouse in Port Royal. He put in $310,000, most of it borrowed against the equity in his and Vanessa's home, some of it a personal loan I co-signed against my own better judgment, because he is my son and I wanted to believe in him the way Walter always believed in people past the point good sense recommended. The restaurant failed in 18 months. Rising food costs, a partner who mismanaged the books, a location that never found its lunch crowd. Preston lost almost the entire investment. He went back into sales, but at a lower level than before, because 2 years is a long gap on a resume and the market had moved on without him. Vanessa's real estate commissions became the larger share of their household income, which I think wounded something in Preston that he's never said out loud, because Preston, like a lot of men raised to believe providing is identity, does not have language for what it feels like to stop being the one who provides. I want to be fair to my son here, the way I try to be fair to every subject I've ever built a case around, because understanding why someone reaches for money that isn't theirs helps you understand exactly how far they'll reach. Preston is not cruel. Preston is frightened, in the specific way a man is frightened when he believes his worth is measured in a number on a bank statement, and that number has been shrinking for 4 years while his wife's has been growing. Vanessa Cole grew up in Ridgeland, in a single wide with a mother who worked 2 jobs and a father who left before Vanessa turned 6. She built herself into a real estate agent through sheer relentlessness, the kind of woman who returns calls at 9 p.m. and shows houses on Sundays. I respect that. I respected it for years. But somewhere in the last 4 years, watching her husband's income shrink while hers grew, Vanessa started doing arithmetic about the future that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with security, the kind of security she never had as a child and has been terrified of losing ever since. I remember a Thanksgiving 3 years ago, before any of this began, when Vanessa mentioned, almost offhand while drying dishes beside me, that her mother had died with $11 in her checking account and a landlord threatening eviction on a trailer that wasn't even worth fighting over. "I think about that a lot," she said, not looking up from the plate in her hands. "How fast nothing can just stay nothing forever." I remember thinking, at the time, that it was simply grief talking, a daughter mourning a hard life her mother never escaped. I understand now that it was something closer to a warning I didn't know to take seriously. Vanessa was not raised to trust that money arrives on anyone's natural timeline. She was raised to believe that if you don't reach for it the moment it's within reach, it disappears, the way everything in her childhood disappeared the moment her family stopped being able to hold on to it. 14 months ago, at Lily's 7th birthday party, Vanessa's friend Tabitha Reyes was there. Tabitha is a certified geriatric care manager, the kind of professional families hire to help navigate elder care decisions, and I want to be precise about her role in this because it matters. Tabitha is not evil. Tabitha is a woman who gets a placement referral commission when a family moves a parent into a facility she recommends, and who has, over years of doing this work, developed a very fluent, very comfortable vocabulary for describing an aging parent's independence as a liability that needs managing. I overheard Tabitha talking to Vanessa in my own backyard that day, over paper plates of birthday cake. "You'd be amazed how fast a competency evaluation moves once you've got 2 data points," Tabitha said. A missed medication, a confused phone call, something documented by a doctor. 6 months, sometimes less, and you've got a court-appointed guardian in place. Camellia Manor's got a beautiful memory suite opening in the fall. I could get her a spot. I remember thinking, at the time, that it was an unsettling but ordinary conversation, the kind people have about aging parents in general terms. I did not yet know they were talking about me. I know now. That was 14 months before I stood in Preston's hallway with a cooling casserole dish. 14 months is a long runway for a plan to develop, and I would come to learn, over the following months of quiet documentation, exactly how much runway they had used. I did not sleep well the night I overheard that phone call. I sat at my kitchen table, the same oak table where Walter and I used to review the Trust's quarterly statements together, and I did what I have done for 35 years when I am frightened by a number I don't yet understand. I opened a file. A literal manila folder, because old habits from a paper-based career never fully die, and I wrote on the tab in pencil, "Whitfield Matter." Then, underneath, in smaller letters, "Confidential." The first thing I did, 3 days later, was call my daughter Diane. Diane is 46, an emergency room nurse in Denver, and she is, by geography and by temperament, the one person in this family least entangled in whatever Preston and Vanessa were building. Diane loves her brother, but Diane has also spent 20 years in emergency medicine learning to read a room for what's actually happening underneath what people are saying, and I needed exactly that kind of eye on this before I trusted my own perception of it. "Mom, are you sure you heard him right?" she asked, when I told her, careful, because she loves her brother and did not want to believe it either. "I've spent 35 years being sure of exactly what I heard in a room, Diane. I don't misquote people. It's the one professional habit I never learned to turn off." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said the thing that told me she believed me. "Preston asked me last month if I thought you were still sharp. I thought it was a strange thing to ask. I didn't think anything of it at the time. That's how these things work. Nobody thinks anything of it at the time. Not until someone starts collecting the small strange things and lining them up next to each other, and I have spent my entire career being the person who lines things up." Over the following 2 weeks, I did what I would have done for any client who came to me suspecting a family member was maneuvering around a trust. I documented. Quietly, methodically, without confronting anyone, because at Lowcountry Trust, we had a rule I lived by for 3 decades: you never tip your hand before the file is complete, because a half-finished case is just an accusation, and an accusation without documentation is a gift you hand to the people you're accusing. I started with my own medical records, because I understood immediately that Tabitha's phrase, a missed medication, a confused phone call, something documented by a doctor, meant the plan required evidence of decline. And if no real evidence existed, someone would need to manufacture it. I called my primary care physician, Dr. Elaine Marsh, whom I've seen for 11 years, and asked her office to send me a complete copy of my chart. Every visit, every note, every medication, going back 3 years. What I found, when I read through 43 pages of my own medical history at my kitchen table with my reading glasses on, the same tortoiseshell pair I've worn since I was 40, was a single entry that stopped me cold. 6 weeks earlier, an entry from a nurse practitioner I had never met, at a walk-in clinic I had never visited, noting that a family member, Preston Whitfield, had called to report concerns about increasing confusion and a fall in the driveway. I have never fallen in my driveway. I have never authorized anyone to call a clinic on my behalf. And I have certainly never been seen by a nurse practitioner I've never met, at a clinic on the other side of town, for a visit I never attended. Someone had called that clinic, described symptoms I do not have, and asked that a note be placed in a file associated with my name and date of birth, presumably hoping it would eventually surface in exactly the kind of competency evaluation Tabitha had described in my backyard. I called the clinic myself the next morning. I did not accuse. I asked, in the calm, procedural voice I used for 35 years when requesting records from other institutions, whether they could clarify how a chart note comes to exist without a corresponding office visit. The office manager, flustered, explained that Preston had called claiming to be arranging an appointment on my behalf due to memory concerns, described specific incidents to the intake nurse, and the nurse practitioner, without ever examining me, had documented the reported concerns as a collateral history entry, standard practice, she said, when a concerned family member calls ahead of a first visit that never actually occurred. I asked her to send me written confirmation, by mail, that no examination had taken place. She did. I filed it. Tab 1. I want to explain something about what that entry meant to me, professionally, because it is the single most important piece of evidence in this entire story. In guardianship law, courts rely heavily on medical documentation of cognitive decline. A single credible-looking clinical note, even one based entirely on a phone call, can become the seed of an entire competency evaluation. My son had planted that seed 6 weeks before I ever heard the words "once she's gone," which meant the plan had been in motion far longer than 14 months. It meant the birthday party conversation with Tabitha wasn't the beginning. It was already the middle. Once I understood that, I stopped thinking of this as a family disagreement I could smooth over with a conversation. I started building a case file the way I would have built one for any client at Lowcountry Trust who suspected exactly this kind of maneuver, because that is precisely what this was, regardless of whose name was on the account. Over the next month, I documented every contact Preston and Vanessa had with any professional connected to guardianship, medical evaluation, or elder placement. I am, by nature and by training, a woman who keeps records, and I discovered that this habit, which Walter used to affectionately call Nora's paper trail personality, was about to become the only thing standing between me and a locked door at Camellia Manor. I opened a second bank account at a different institution, one Preston had no signing authority on and had never been told about, purely as a precaution, moving a modest emergency reserve there in case anyone attempted to freeze or access my existing accounts. I did this the same week I discovered the clinic note, because a trust officer's first instinct, when she suspects a threat to an account, is to secure the assets before she does anything else. You do not wait to protect the money until after you understand the whole plot. You protect the money first, and investigate second. I also called Harold Voss, an elder law attorney I had referred at least a dozen clients to over the years at Lowcountry Trust, and who I trusted precisely because I had watched him dismantle 3 fraudulent guardianship petitions in front of a judge. Harold had retired from litigation 2 years earlier but still consulted privately. I met him at his home office on a Thursday afternoon, and I told him everything. The overheard phone call. The Tabitha conversation at Lily's birthday. The fabricated clinic note. Harold listened for nearly an hour without interrupting, an old habit of his I remembered fondly from depositions decades earlier. When I finished, he took off his glasses, set them on the desk, and said, "Nora, I've seen a lot of these. This is one of the more organized ones I've heard described. Whoever is coaching them knows exactly what a court wants to see. That's what worries me more than the sun. Family members panic and improvise. Someone here is following a playbook." "Tabitha Reyes," I said. "She's a certified geriatric care manager. She gets a placement fee if I end up at Camellia Manor." Harold made a note. "That's not illegal on its face. Care managers refer clients to facilities all the time. But if she's coaching them on how to manufacture a paper trail for an incompetency finding, and there's a financial incentive tied to the outcome, that starts to look like something a licensing board would take an interest in. We'll want that documented separately." He paused. "Nora, I have to ask you directly, because I'd ask any client this. Do you have any actual cognitive concerns? Any memory lapses, any confusion, anything a fair evaluation might legitimately find?" I appreciated the question, because it was exactly the question I would have asked a client in my position, and because Harold asking it plainly, without flinching, told me he'd treat this case with the same rigor he'd bring to any petition, not soften sentiment because he liked me personally. "No," I told him. "I balanced my own checkbook to the penny last night for the 40th year in a row. I still remember every trust document I ever drafted well enough to recite the distribution schedules from memory. If they want to test my competency, Harold, I welcome it. I'll pass with room to spare, and then their entire manufactured record becomes evidence against them instead of evidence against me." Harold smiled for the first time that afternoon. "Then let's make sure that's exactly how it plays out. We're going to want an independent evaluation on our terms, before they file anything on theirs. We control the timeline from here forward." That was the turning point. Instead of waiting to be evaluated on my son's schedule, using his manufactured chart note as ammunition, I was going to walk into an evaluation of my own choosing, on my own timeline, with my own attorney's documentation of exactly how the opposing record had been fabricated, and come out the other side with an official, current, unimpeachable finding that I was fully competent. It is the same strategy one used against 3 separate families at Lowcountry Trust who tried to remove an elderly trustee through manufactured medical narratives. You do not fight a fabricated diagnosis with outrage. You fight it with a better, more current, more credible one of your own. Harold referred me to Dr. Simone Patel, a geriatric psychiatrist in Charleston with a specialty in exactly this kind of contested competency evaluation, someone the courts in 3 counties trusted because her reports were famously, punishingly thorough. I scheduled an appointment for 6 weeks out, the earliest she had, and in the meantime I kept documenting. I called my old assistant at Lowcountry Trust, Grace Pham, who still worked there and had access to institutional knowledge about how guardianship petitions typically moved through the local probate court. Not asking her to do anything improper, only to help me understand the standard timeline, so I would know how much runway Preston and Vanessa likely believed they had. Grace confirmed what I already suspected: an uncontested petition, supported by even minimal medical documentation, could move to a hearing in as little as 5 months in our county, faster if the petitioning family requested an emergency temporary guardianship, which required even less evidence, only an allegation of imminent risk. That detail frightened me more than anything else Harold had told me. An emergency temporary guardianship. If Preston or Vanessa alleged I was in imminent danger to myself, a court could grant temporary control over my affairs within days, before any hearing, before I had a chance to present a single piece of my own evidence. I asked Harold about it directly. That's their fastest path, he confirmed. It requires an affidavit alleging immediate risk. A fall, a missed critical medication, wandering, something dramatic. If they've fabricated one clinic note already, Nora, I'd assume they're building toward exactly that kind of allegation. That was the moment I understood I needed more than documents. I needed witnesses who could speak to my actual daily competence, in real time, from a position no one could later dismiss as biased. And I needed to understand exactly what Preston and Vanessa were building toward, in enough detail to anticipate their next move instead of only reacting to their last one. I called June Castellano, my oldest friend, a woman I'd known since we were girls on Bay Street, whose last name I happened to share by coincidence rather than blood, and who had spent 30 years as a court reporter in the Beaufort County Courthouse before retiring. June has sat in more competency hearings, more guardianship disputes, and more contested trust litigations than almost anyone in this county who wasn't a judge, because she transcribed every word of them for 3 decades. I told her everything over coffee at her kitchen table, the same way she'd told me things across that same table for 50 years. June set down her cup halfway through and didn't pick it back up. Nora, I have sat through I don't know how many of these hearings. I could tell you which ones were legitimate and which ones were a family that got greedy before their mother could reasonably be expected to die. She reached across the table and took my hand. This sounds like the second kind. And I want you to know, right now, before you ask, that I will sit in whatever room you need me to sit in and tell whatever judge or whatever family needs to hear it exactly what I see with my own eyes. Which is a sharper woman than most 60-year-olds I know. I need more than a character witness, June. I need someone who can document specific, dated interactions. The same way I'd need a corroborating witness for any contested account. Then start inviting me to things, she said simply. Lunch. Your book club. Let me be in the room enough that if anyone tries to say you're declining, I can put a date and a detail on every single time I saw otherwise. Over the following 2 months, June became a quiet, constant presence in my life again, the way she'd been decades earlier before both our lives got busy with children and careers. Weekly lunches. A Thursday book club I rejoined after a 5-year absence. She kept a private notebook, her old court reporter habits taking over, dating every entry, noting specific details, the crossword we'd both finished in 9 minutes, the argument I'd won at book club about an author's intent, the afternoon I helped her navigate a Medicare billing dispute over the phone, on hold with an insurance company for 40 minutes without once losing my patience or my place in the argument. I also began, carefully, documenting my own daily life the way I once instructed nervous elderly clients to document theirs when they suspected a family member was building a case against their independence. I kept a detailed calendar, not just appointments but small tasks completed, bills paid on time with confirmation numbers logged, prescriptions managed with a weekly pill organizer I photographed each Sunday after filling it correctly, my checkbook balanced monthly to the penny with bank statements attached as proof. I know this sounds excessive. It is not excessive. It is exactly the kind of granular, dated, boring documentation that defeats a fabricated narrative of decline, because boring, consistent competence, proven day after day, is the single hardest thing for a false narrative to argue against. I also, quietly, began paying closer attention to Rosa Delgado, who has cleaned my house every other week for 6 years and who, I realized during this period, was often present at Preston's house too, since Vanessa had recommended Rosa to her own cleaning service years earlier and Rosa cleaned for both households on alternating weeks. I did not ask Rosa to spy for me. I would never put an employee in that position. But 6 weeks into my documentation, Rosa mentioned something to me, unprompted, while dusting the same bookshelf where Walter's engineering awards sit. "Miss Nora, can I ask you something strange? Vanessa's friend, the one who visits sometimes, she asked me last week if you seemed forgetful. If you ever left the stove on, if you ever seemed confused when I was there." Rosa looked embarrassed even repeating it. I told her no. I told her you're sharper than my own mother, and my mother's 62. But it felt like a strange question. She wrote something down after I answered. I asked Rosa if she'd be willing to write out exactly what she remembered being asked, and when, in her own words, dated and signed, purely so my attorney could keep an accurate record. Rosa agreed without hesitation. That statement, handwritten, dated, signed by a long-time employee with no financial stake in the outcome, describing an unsolicited, leading question from Tabitha Reyes about fabricated symptoms of decline, became one of the most damaging pieces of evidence in the entire case file. Tab 2. 4 months into my documentation, I sat down with Dr. Simone Patel for a full cognitive and psychiatric evaluation, on my own timeline, funded by my own money, referred by my own attorney. It took 3 sessions over 2 weeks, standardized cognitive testing, a full clinical interview, a review of my actual medical history, and, at my request, a review of the fabricated clinic note, which Dr. Patel flagged in her final report as clinically unsupported and inconsistent with any documented examination. Her final written report, 11 pages, concluded, in language I will remember for the rest of my life because it was the single most validating document anyone has ever written about me, that I demonstrated cognitive function, memory, and executive reasoning significantly above age-adjusted norms, with no clinical indication of impairment, decline, or diminished capacity in any domain assessed. Tab 3. I now had, 4.5 months into my investigation, a case file that would have made any senior trust officer proud. A fabricated medical record, documented and disproven. A witness statement from a longtime employee describing an unsolicited attempt to manufacture evidence of decline. A weekly, dated log of my own competent daily functioning, corroborated by an independent friend's contemporaneous notes. And a comprehensive, current, independent psychiatric evaluation finding me not merely competent, but sharper than the average person 20 years younger. But I still did not have the thing I actually wanted, which was proof of the plan itself, the guardianship petition Preston and Vanessa were building toward, and proof of exactly how the $4.2 million was meant to move once they had control. Harold and I discussed this at length. A fabricated clinic note and a suspicious question to a housekeeper were strong evidence of intent, but I wanted, the way I always wanted for every trust one ever administered, the complete picture before I acted. At Lowcountry Trust, we never closed a file at 40% complete when we suspected there was more. That is when I decided to do something I had never done in my professional life and never expected to do in my personal one. I decided to let them believe they were succeeding. I called Preston myself, on a Sunday, and told him, in a deliberately smaller, softer voice than my own, that I'd been having some trouble sleeping, some trouble remembering where I'd put things around the house. It cost me something to say those words out loud, even knowing they were bait. 40 years of a career built on precision, and I was choosing to sound uncertain on purpose. But I understood, from decades of watching people reach for money that wasn't theirs yet, that the fastest way to see the whole plan is to let the people building it believe no one is watching. Preston's voice changed instantly, and not with concern, though he performed concern beautifully. There was a current underneath it I recognized immediately, the current of a man who has been waiting for exactly this opening. "Mom, that's actually really good you're telling me this. I've been worried. Have you talked to Dr. Marsh?" I told him I hadn't, that I didn't want to make a fuss. He offered, almost too quickly, to help me get checked out, just to be safe. 3 days later, an appointment appeared on my calendar, one I had not made, at the same walk-in clinic where the first fabricated note had originated. I did not cancel it. I attended it, on purpose, with Harold's blessing, and I performed nothing at all. I answered every question from the nurse practitioner honestly and precisely, correctly recalled the date, the president, the sequence of numbers backward, the 3-object memory test at 5 minutes. I passed every screening measure cleanly, on the record, in an actual chart with an actual examination behind it this time. That visit became tab 4, an official record directly contradicting anything Preston might later present, created at his own instigation, under his own encouragement, which meant he could not later claim I'd hidden my decline from a legitimate evaluation. He had walked me directly into creating the strongest evidence against his own plan. 2 weeks after that appointment, June called me, her voice tight in a way I rarely heard from her. She'd had lunch with a mutual acquaintance, a paralegal at a firm in Beaufort, who mentioned, in passing conversation about unrelated gossip, that she'd recently typed up an emergency temporary guardianship petition for a family named Whitfield. Harold confirmed it within the hour through the court's public filing index. Preston Whitfield had filed a petition for emergency temporary guardianship over me, Nora Whitfield, citing escalating memory concerns, a documented clinical visit reflecting cognitive decline, and risk of harm to self due to impaired judgment regarding personal safety and finances. The petition named Preston as proposed temporary guardian of both my person and my estate. A hearing was scheduled in 11 days, the accelerated emergency timeline Harold had warned me about months earlier. I want to tell you honestly what that felt like, reading my own son's name on a legal filing asking a judge to strip me of control over my own life, 11 days before it would happen, based on a chart note he had fabricated with a phone call to a clinic. It felt like the floor of my own kitchen tilting, the way I imagine Walter's steel hull reinforcements must feel the first moment they take on real weight in open water. But I had spent 35 years building exactly this kind of file for exactly this kind of moment, and I did not fall apart. I called Harold. Then I opened my case file, the physical manila folder that now held 11 months of documentation, and I began preparing not for a family conversation, but for a hearing, and for the family conversation I intended to have first, on my terms, before that hearing ever needed to happen. If you've ever built something with your own hands, a family, a fortune, a life, and had someone close to you quietly plan to take it before you were even finished living in it, stay with me. This is where it turns. I called Diane in Denver that same evening and told her everything, including the petition. She was on a flight 2 days later, taking emergency leave from the hospital, because Diane, whatever else has shifted in this family, has never once hesitated when I actually needed her. I asked Harold whether we should simply fight the petition in court, quietly, attorney to attorney, without ever confronting Preston and Vanessa directly. Harold left the decision to me, but he was candid about the tactical advantage either path offered. A courtroom win embarrasses them in front of a judge. A family confrontation, done right, with the same evidence, embarrasses them in front of people whose opinion they'll have to live with for the rest of their lives, and it lets you control exactly how much mercy gets extended afterward. Courts don't do mercy, Nora. Families can. I chose the family. Not because I wanted to spare Preston. Because I wanted him, and Vanessa, and Tabitha Reyes, to understand exactly what they had built, in a room where I could look each of them in the eye and decide, in real time, how much of their future I was willing to let this destroy. I invited them to dinner. Preston, Vanessa, and, at my specific insistence, Tabitha Reyes, whom I described in the invitation only as someone I understand has been advising the family, and I'd like her included in this conversation. I invited Diane, who flew in and sat quietly beside me. I invited June, who came not as a friend that night but, at my request, in the capacity closest to her old professional life, to observe and, if it ever became necessary, to testify to exactly what she witnessed. And I invited Harold Voss, who arrived in a gray suit with a legal pad and sat at the end of my table the way he once sat at the end of conference tables defeating exactly this kind of petition for other families. I set my table the way I used to lay out client files at Lowcountry Trust before a difficult meeting, everything in its place, everything with purpose. Walter's good plates, the ones from our 30th anniversary. A pot roast, because some conversations deserve to happen over a meal that took real time to prepare, so no one can later say the whole evening was cold. And beside my own plate, the manila folder, now grown to 96 pages, tabbed, numbered, a table of contents on the first page the way I organized every trust file I ever presented in a dispute. Preston arrived first, kissed my cheek, told me the pot roast smelled wonderful, and had no idea what was coming. Vanessa arrived polished, warm, calling me Nora in the bright voice she uses when she wants a room to feel comfortable. Tabitha arrived last, a little confused about why she'd been invited to a family dinner at all, which told me she did not yet understand how much I already knew about her role in this. We ate first. I insisted on it, the same way I once insisted every difficult client meeting begin with basic civility, because you do not deliver hard truths to a person who hasn't been given the chance to sit down and settle first. We talked about Mason's baseball season and Lily's tap recital. Vanessa complimented the pot roast. Preston refilled everyone's water glasses, the good host, the good son, performing a version of himself I once believed in completely. When the plates were cleared, I asked Preston to walk Mason and Lily, whom Diane had brought over separately for the evening, into the den to watch a movie, because what came next was not for them. He did, and when he returned and sat back down, I placed my hand flat on the folder and I began. I'd like to talk about a phone call, I said, that I overheard in your sunroom 11 months ago. Preston's face changed instantly. You told Tabitha, quote, once she's gone, we split the 4.2. 50-50, that's what you agreed. The table went silent in the particular way a room goes silent when the thing everyone has been avoiding finally has a name. Vanessa's hand moved to her water glass and did not pick it up. Mom, I don't even remember saying that exactly. I do, I said. I have spent 35 years being precise about exactly what I hear in a room. It is the one professional habit I never learned to turn off. I opened the folder to the first tab. I'd like to walk through what's happened since that phone call, in order, with dates. All of you are welcome to correct anything I get wrong, provided you can show me documentation that contradicts it. Tab 1. I laid the clinic record on the table, the confirmation letter from the office manager stating plainly that no examination of me had ever taken place before Preston called and described symptoms to an intake nurse. 6 weeks before I overheard that phone call, Preston, you called a clinic I have never visited and described a fall in my driveway that never happened, and a level of confusion I have never experienced. That call created a medical record, without an examination, that could later be used to support a competency finding. I let that sit. Preston's face had gone the particular gray of a man watching a wall he built come down from the inside. Vanessa's mouth opened. "Preston, you told me the doctor called us, you said." "Vanessa, I'll get to your part," I said, gently, but without stopping. Tab 2. I placed Rose's handwritten, signed statement on the table. 4 months ago, Tabitha, you asked my housekeeper, unprompted, whether I seemed forgetful, whether I left the stove on, whether I seemed confused in her presence. She told you no. She told you I was sharper than her own mother. You wrote something down anyway. Tabitha's face had gone very still, the stillness of a professional realizing her name has entered a file she did not expect to be in. I don't recall the specifics of that conversation, Tabitha said carefully. I have Rose's statement, dated and signed, describing it in her own words. I'd rather you review it than dispute my memory of it. I placed it directly in front of her. She read it. She said nothing further. Tab 3. I placed Dr. Patel's 11-page evaluation on the table. 4.5 months ago, I underwent a full independent psychiatric and cognitive evaluation, on my own initiative, funded by my own money, conducted by a specialist with no relationship to this family. Her conclusion, in her own words, is that my cognitive function is significantly above age-adjusted norms, with no clinical indication of impairment in any domain assessed. I turned the report so Preston could read the highlighted conclusion himself. This was completed before you filed anything, Preston. Which means whatever petition you filed afterward was filed with an independent, current, contradicting evaluation already sitting in existence, whether you knew it or not. Preston's hands had gone flat on the table, the exact posture of a man realizing the ground had already shifted before he ever took his first step onto it. Tab 4. I placed the second clinic record, the one from the appointment Preston himself had arranged after I deliberately told him I'd been forgetful, on top of the pile. 2 weeks after our phone call, you scheduled an appointment for me at the same clinic. I attended it. I passed every screening measure cleanly, on an actual record, with an actual examination behind it this time. You arranged the very appointment that created the strongest evidence against your own petition. Mom, I don't understand, you said you were having trouble. I know what I said, Preston. I said it on purpose, because I needed to understand exactly how far this had already gone before I intervened. At the bank, we called that letting a subject demonstrate the full scope of their intent before you close the file. I'm sorry it required deceiving you, briefly. I am not sorry about what it revealed. I turned to the final section. Tab 5. I placed the court filing index printout on the table, the petition for emergency temporary guardianship filed 11 days ago, Preston's name listed as proposed guardian of both my person and my estate. The room went colder than the pot roast on the table. Vanessa's eyes moved to Preston, then to the folder, then to Harold, sitting quietly at the end of the table with his own legal pad, and I watched her do the math a real estate agent does instinctively, the math of a woman who has spent her career reading exactly how much trouble a piece of paper can represent. Harold Voss has reviewed this petition in full, I said. He is prepared to appear at the hearing in 6 days with Dr. Patel's evaluation, the clinic's written confirmation that the original chart note was fabricated without examination, and a sworn statement from a longtime employee describing an unsolicited attempt to manufacture evidence of decline. I am prepared, Harold tells me, to have this petition dismissed with prejudice, and depending on how today goes, potentially referred for review regarding the fabricated medical record. Vanessa spoke first, her voice climbing in the particular register of someone reaching for the version of the story where she is the wronged party. Nora, we were scared. Preston's income has been unstable for 4 years. We have 2 kids, tuition. We watched you get older after Walter died and we panicked about what would happen to that money if something happened to you before. Before what, Vanessa? I asked, and I kept my voice as gentle as I have ever kept it, which I have learned, over 35 years, unsettles people far more than anger does. Before I actually died? Because that's the plan the trust already accounts for. 60% to my children, 40% to my grandchildren, staged over their lifetimes, exactly as Walter and I structured it decades ago. You did not need a guardianship petition to receive what was always going to be yours eventually. You needed one to receive it now, while I was still alive to disagree with how you spent it. Preston's voice came out smaller than I had heard it since he was a boy. It wasn't about the money being available now, Mom. It was, Tabitha said if we waited for you to actually pass, we might be looking at years, decades even, and the restaurant loan, the second mortgage, we're barely. I know exactly what state your finances are in, Preston, because I co-signed a $310,000 loan for a restaurant that failed, and I have watched you struggle under the weight of that decision for 4 years with genuine sympathy. But sympathy for your fear does not excuse manufacturing a false medical record to take control of my life before I've finished living it. I turned, finally, to Tabitha. You told my daughter-in-law, in my own backyard, 14 months ago, that a competency evaluation moves fast with 2 documented data points. You told my housekeeper, unprompted, to watch for symptoms I don't have. You have a placement fee waiting for you at Camellia Manor if I end up there. I've spent 35 years reading exactly this kind of financial incentive into exactly this kind of professional advice. I don't believe you're malicious, Tabitha. I believe you've done this enough times that it stopped feeling like harm to you a long time ago. But it is harm, and Harold has already begun drafting a complaint to your licensing board. Tabitha said nothing. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't have made it worse. Diane spoke for the first time that evening, quietly, to her brother. Preston, she asked me last month if I thought Mom was still sharp. I didn't think anything of it. I keep thinking about how many small strange things I didn't think anything of. The dining room held the particular silence that follows a long-avoided truth finally being spoken aloud and full. Vanessa was crying, not performing tears exactly, but not entirely without an eye on how the room was receiving them either. Preston sat with his head in his hands. Tabitha stared at the tablecloth. I closed the folder. Here's what happens now, I said, in the same measured voice I once used to explain a distribution schedule to a grieving widow. Harold will appear at the hearing in 6 days. The petition will be withdrawn, or it will be dismissed on the record, along with everything that comes with a dismissal on this evidence. That part is not negotiable, and it does not depend on anything said at this table tonight. I let that settle. What is negotiable is what happens to this family afterward, and that depends entirely on what I hear in the next few minutes. Preston lifted his head. Mom, I am so sorry. I don't have a version of this where I don't look like exactly what I am, which is a man who let his own fear turn into something unforgivable. I don't know how to undo it. You don't undo 11 months of this in one dinner, Preston. But I will tell you what I told 100 families over 35 years who came to me after a fracture like this one. Money you take before it's rightfully yours is never actually money. It's a debt you owe the person you took it from, whether a court ever calls it that or not. You owe me 11 months of decisions I now have to live with knowing you made. That debt doesn't clear because you're sorry tonight. It clears slowly, the way trust always rebuilds, which is to say, one honest year at a time. I looked at Vanessa. You are Mason and Lily's mother, and I love those children without condition, and nothing that happened this year changes that. But I want you to understand something clearly. I am not confused. I am not declining. I built the very trust you were trying to access early, and I built it, deliberately, so that no single person in this family could ever move that money faster than time and good judgment allow. That includes me. It includes Preston. It always included whoever eventually tried exactly what you tried. I turned to the folder one last time. The trust itself does not change tonight. 60% to my children, 40% staged to my grandchildren, exactly as Walter and I always intended. I am not disinheriting anyone in anger, because Walter didn't build that structure so I could weaponize it in a moment of hurt. But I am, as of Monday morning, moving the successor trustee designation from an unnamed corporate trustee to Diane, effective immediately upon any future incapacity of my own, removing any ambiguity that could ever again be exploited. Preston nodded slowly, understanding exactly what that meant, and did not argue with it, which told me something honest was finally happening in him. And Tabitha, I said, you will not set foot in my home again, and I would ask that you not offer Preston or Vanessa any further guidance regarding my care, ever. Before she gathered her purse to go, Tabitha said one more thing, quietly, not quite an apology and not quite an excuse. The way people speak when they're trying to explain themselves to their own conscience more than to the room. I've done this for 11 years. I've placed 40, 50 families into care, and most of the time I'm the person who makes an impossible decision easier for everyone. I stopped asking myself, a long time ago, whether the parent actually needed it, or just whether the family wanted it fast. She looked at me, and for the first time all evening, something in her face looked genuinely uncertain. I don't think I've thought about that difference in years, until tonight. I didn't offer her comfort. I didn't offer her forgiveness either. I only said, that difference is the entire job, Tabitha. I hope you find your way back to asking it. She left within minutes after that, quietly, without further argument, because there was nothing left in that room that belonged to her. The hearing, 6 days later, lasted less than 40 minutes. Harold presented Dr. Patel's evaluation, the clinic's written confirmation regarding the fabricated first record, and Rosa's signed statement. The judge, a woman named Constance Ebright who Harold had appeared before a dozen times over the years, read through the file with the particular quiet of someone who has seen this exact pattern before and does not enjoy seeing it again. She dismissed the petition with prejudice, meaning it could never be refiled on the same grounds, and noted for the record her concern regarding the origin of the initial clinic note, referring that specific matter to the State Medical Board for review of the clinic's documentation practices. Preston did not contest the dismissal. He sat in the back row of the courtroom, in a gray suit, and did not say a word the entire hearing, and I understood, watching him, that some part of him was relieved the fight was over even though he had started it. I did not press criminal charges against my son. Harold told me I had grounds to explore it, given the fabricated medical record, but I made the decision the same way I made every difficult decision in my career, by asking what outcome actually served the people I was responsible for, rather than what outcome simply punished the people who had wronged me. Mason and Lily needed a father who wasn't fighting a fraud charge. Diane needed a brother she could eventually forgive. I needed, more than anything, to know I had defended myself with precision rather than vengeance, because precision was always the thing that made me trustworthy in the first place. 6 months later, the family looks different, not repaired exactly, but rebuilding, the slow way real repair always happens. Preston found a new sales position, a steady one, nothing dramatic, and started seeing a counselor on his own initiative, something I never expected from him and have not once mentioned to make him feel watched about it. He calls me every Sunday now, a habit that started the month after the dinner and has not once lapsed, and I notice, the way I notice everything, that the calls have gotten longer and less careful over time, the way conversations do when two people are slowly relearning how to be honest with each other. Vanessa and I remain careful with each other, polite, present at family dinners, but not yet warm, and I don't know that we ever fully will be, and I've made peace with that. She has never offered a full apology, only a smaller one, once, about letting fear get ahead of good judgment, which I accepted for what it was, an incomplete but genuine start. Diane accepted the successor trustee designation without hesitation, and told me, the week after the hearing, that she intends to run it exactly the way I always ran every account I ever managed, boringly, transparently, and on nobody's timeline but the one Walter and I actually wrote down. I still see Rosa every other week. I gave her a bonus that year larger than she expected, and she cried a little when I explained why, and I told her the same thing I'm telling you now. The people who tell the truth when it costs them nothing to lie are the rarest kind of witness a person can have, and I will spend the rest of my life grateful I had one in my own house without ever having asked her to be. June and I still have lunch every Thursday, and her notebook, the one she started keeping the week I told her everything, sits in a drawer in her kitchen now, its job long finished, though she says she's kept the habit anyway, just in case. Old professional instincts, like mine, don't retire even when we do. Mason and Lily know none of the specifics, only that Grandma and their dad had a hard talk and things are better now, which is exactly as much truth as 7-year-olds and 10-year-olds need to carry. I still pick them up from school on Thursdays. I still balance my checkbook to the penny every month, not because anyone is watching anymore, but because 40 years of a habit doesn't disappear just because the reason for it did. Preston came to me alone one evening in late autumn, about 4 months after the hearing, and sat across the same kitchen table where I'd first opened the Whitfield file. He didn't bring an agenda. He brought a small, framed photograph of Walter standing beside a half-finished trawler hull at the shipyard, one I hadn't seen in years, that he'd found going through boxes in his own garage. I keep thinking about what Dad would have said, watching me file that petition, he told me, turning the frame over in his hands like he wasn't sure it was still his to hold. He spent his whole life building things that were supposed to hold weight for decades. I tried to take a shortcut through the one thing he built that was actually supposed to outlast both of us. I told him the truth, which is that Walter would have been heartbroken, not surprised, exactly, because Walter always understood fear better than most people gave him credit for, but heartbroken all the same. Preston nodded and didn't argue with that, either, and for the first time in over a year, I believed the apology sitting across from me instead of simply hearing it. Harold still calls every few months, not about the case, which has been closed and sealed for some time now, but the way old colleagues call, to ask how I'm getting on. He told me once, near the end of it all, that in 30 years of elder law practice, he'd rarely seen a client build a file as complete as the one I brought him, and that most people in my position arrive frightened and scattered, not organized and 3 steps ahead. I told him the same thing I've told most people who've asked me some version of that question over the years. I wasn't frightened and scattered because I'd spent 35 years training for exactly this moment without ever knowing it was coming. My name is Nora Whitfield. I'm 69 years old. I spent 35 years defending other families' money from exactly the kind of plan my own son once built against me, and when it came to my own life, the training held. I lost some trust that year. I lost, for a while, the easy comfort of believing my son would never do something like this. But I kept the trust, in the literal sense, exactly as Walter and I built it. I kept my independence. I kept every Thursday afternoon with my grandchildren, and I kept the one thing 35 years in that career actually taught me, underneath all the numbers, That the people who love you and the people who are waiting on you are not always as easy to tell apart as you'd like to believe, and the only real defense anyone has is patience, documentation, and the courage to look calmly at the whole truth before you ever say a word about it out loud. If you've ever overheard something in your own house that you weren't supposed to hear, and had to decide whether to react or to wait, I hope you choose the way I did. Wait long enough to be certain. Then speak once, and speak completely. If this story reminded you of someone in your own family, or reminded you to keep your own paperwork in better order than you have, drop a comment below and tell me. Subscribe to GM Mom Stories for more, and remember, the quietest woman at the table is very often the one who already knows exactly how the story ends.